When I asked my stepson for a massage, I didn't think much of it. My shoulders had been aching all day, my husband had been away on another endless business trip, and there he was, standing in the kitchen, taller than I remembered, offering help without hesitation. I thought it would be harmless, a small gesture, nothing more. But the moment his hands touched my shoulders, something shifted in the air, something I couldn't name. The warmth of his palms seeped through the thin fabric of my blouse, and suddenly, I felt my breath catch in my throat. I wanted to laugh it off, to tell him it was just the tension melting away, but instead, I sat frozen, listening to the sound of rain outside the window and the faint creak of the chair beneath me. My heart beat too quickly, betraying me, betraying the life I thought I had under control. His voice was calm, almost casual, but every word carried weight I didn't expect. I could feel a storm gathering, not the one outside, but the one inside me. That was the moment everything began to unravel, though I didn't see it clearly then. Not yet. But let me tell you what really happened before that massage became the thing I couldn't forget. Before the night that changed everything. Before I found myself in a place I swore I would never be. The rain had started before dawn, soft at first, just a whisper against the windows, then heavier, until the gutters outside our house spilled over. I woke to the sound, feeling the emptiness on the other side of the bed before I opened my eyes. My husband had left early again. His note was on the counter, neat handwriting, practical words, coffee's ready. Be back Sunday night. Nothing more, nothing less. I stared at those 7 words longer than I should have, feeling their weight. They didn't say I'll miss you, or even call me. They were instructions, like the notes you'd leave for a neighbor feeding your dog. The coffee tasted bitter that morning, though I had added sugar the way I always did. Maybe it wasn't the coffee. Maybe it was the silence. The house seemed too quiet, even with the rain tapping insistently on the windows. It was the kind of quiet that reminded you how much space there was between you and the person you lived with. When my stepson arrived later that day, the house felt different, though I couldn't explain why. He carried a bag over his shoulder, his hair damp from the rain, and smiled when he saw me. Not a polite smile, not the distant smile I had grown used to seeing on my husband's face. This one was warm, easy. I'll take care of the gutters, he said, shaking off the water at the door, like it was the most natural thing in the world to be here, helping me. I told myself it was nothing, that it meant nothing, but I felt my posture straighten, the way my hand instinctively went to smooth my hair. It embarrassed me that I even noticed the gesture. He moved through the house with a kind of energy that stirred the stillness. He fixed the loose curtain rod in the living room, replaced the light bulb in the hallway, and laughed softly when he realized I had been using a chair to reach the top shelves in the kitchen. You should have called, he said, as if he had always been the one I should call. By afternoon, the rain hadn't stopped, and the sky outside had the dull grayness that made the day feel longer than it was. I found myself watching him as he worked, how focused he was, how easy his movements seemed. There was nothing inappropriate in the glance, at least that's what I told myself, but there was something unfamiliar, a flicker of awareness I hadn't felt in years. When the gutters were clear, and the tools put away, he sat across from me at the kitchen table. We had tea instead of coffee. He didn't drink coffee, he reminded me, and the conversation flowed easier than I expected. We didn't talk about anything monumental. The rain, the repairs, how the garden would look when the sun returned. But there was a softness to his voice that stayed with me. By evening, the house smelled faintly of the stew I had started earlier, but the scent barely registered. I felt restless, like the walls of the house were closer than they should be. The silence from my husband's absence used to be something I could ignore, something I could fill with chores and television and empty phone calls to friends. But that day, it pressed in on me. When I stood at the sink washing the last dish, I felt the ache in my shoulders return, the dull, familiar kind of ache that had been there for weeks, from lifting boxes, from leaning over too much, from sleeping wrong on too many lonely nights. He noticed before I even said anything. "You look tense," he said, his voice casual, like he was observing the weather. "I've had this pain for days," I admitted, rubbing at the knot in my shoulder. He didn't hesitate. "I can help. I took a massage class in college, remember?" I did remember, vaguely, though I had never thought much of it. But in that moment, I didn't question it. I didn't think of anything, really. I only felt the ache in my shoulders and the warm suggestion in his voice. I sat in the chair by the window, rain still streaking the glass, and let him stand behind me. His hands were warm, firmer than I expected, pressing lightly at first, then deeper, finding the knots I hadn't even realized were there. The sound of the rain filled the room, steady and unbroken, while the rest of the world seemed to fall away. I closed my eyes, telling myself it was nothing, that it was just a massage, just a moment of relief. But the truth I couldn't ignore, even then, was that when his hands pressed into my shoulders, something stirred that had been silent for too long. Something I thought had been gone for good. The rain didn't let up through the night, turning the roads outside into rivers and painting the windows with streaks that shimmered in the glow of the streetlights. I lay in bed for hours, listening to the water, my shoulders still tingling faintly from his hands. I told myself it was ridiculous to think about it, that it was just a moment, a kind, harmless gesture. But that didn't stop the memory from coming back, again and again, in the quiet of the house. When morning came, I moved through the motions of my routine, but each step felt slower. The coffee steamed on the table, untouched. The silence felt heavier than usual, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I caught myself glancing at the clock, wondering when I'd hear him moving around, when I'd see him walk into the kitchen. It wasn't something I admitted to myself outright, not yet, but there it was, a flicker of anticipation I didn't want to name. By late morning, the rain shifted from a steady pour to scattered bursts, but the sky remained a thick, stubborn gray. He appeared in the hallway with a bundle of towels, his hair still damp, his shirt clinging slightly from the humidity. He smiled like nothing about yesterday had been unusual, like he hadn't touched my shoulders and sparked something in me that I was still trying to smother. I tried to match that ease, to act as if nothing had changed. I busied myself in the kitchen, slicing fruit, pretending to be focused on mundane tasks. But when he stepped closer to reach a mug from the cabinet above me, I felt my breath catch, not from fear, but from the awareness of how close we were, how the space between us seemed smaller than it should have been. The day stretched lazily, but the tension underneath was anything but lazy. We talked about errands, about what needed fixing next, about how the roof might need looking at before the next storm. But each conversation felt layered, as if there were words we weren't saying beneath the ones we were. When the rain started again in the afternoon, heavier this time, he suggested we sit out on the porch for air. I almost said no, almost told him I had things to do inside, but instead, I found myself stepping into my boots and following him out to the covered veranda. The porch smelled of wet wood and earth. The rain fell in thick sheets beyond the railing, blurring the outline of the garden. We sat side by side on the old bench, the cushions still slightly damp, the air cool against our skin. At first, we talked about nothing, the rain, the forecast, how quiet the neighborhood seemed. But the conversation shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if the rain had given permission for something deeper. He asked if I ever missed living somewhere else, if I ever thought about how life might have been different. The question caught me off guard. It wasn't intrusive, but it wasn't small talk either. I hesitated before answering, not because I didn't have an answer, but because I had too many. I told him that sometimes I missed parts of myself, parts one hadn't seen in years. He nodded, like he understood, and for a moment we both sat in silence, listening to the rain. Then it happened, the kind of moment that starts without warning and ends before you fully understand it. He shifted closer, maybe to hear me better over the rain, maybe for no reason at all. His hand brushed mine on the bench, just a graze, and neither of us moved away. I looked at him, and he looked at me, and there was no confusion in his eyes, no hesitation. We po. It was a fleeting touch, soft, almost questioning. But it was enough to make the world tilt, enough to make my heart hammer against my ribs. I pulled back first, my breath uneven, my mind a whirl of thoughts I couldn't hold still. The rain kept falling, indifferent to the moment that had just split my life into before and after. We didn't speak for a long time. I don't know if it was seconds or minutes, it felt like both. Finally, I stood, brushing invisible dust from my jeans, and said something meaningless about needing to check on the stew inside. My voice didn't sound like mine. He stayed on the bench as I went inside, and I felt his gaze on my back, heavy but not unkind. Inside, the kitchen felt too bright, the ticking of the clock too loud. I leaned against the counter, my hands trembling slightly as I held onto it. It was just a kiss, I told myself. Just a single moment, small enough to be erased if I wanted it to be. But deep down, beneath the rationalizations and excuses, I already knew it wasn't small at all. The kiss haunted me through the night like an echo that refused to fade. I lay awake, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, the rain's relentless tapping against the windows sounding like an accusation. I told myself again and again that it was only a moment, a fleeting lapse, but the more I tried to shrink it down, the larger it seemed to grow in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that small, soft collision of lips again, and my chest tightened with a mixture of guilt and something far more dangerous, the faint pulse of wanting more. When I woke the next morning, the sky was pale, washed out, the rain finally gone, but my mind felt heavier than the weather. The kitchen smelled faintly of the stew from the day before. I barely tasted my coffee. I found myself staring at the doorway, as if waiting for him to appear, though I didn't even know what I wanted if he did. The house felt quieter than usual, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that made you hyper-aware of every sound. The creak of the floorboards, the soft hum of the fridge, even the ticking of the clock felt louder, as if the house knew what had happened, as if the walls themselves might whisper it out loud if I stayed still long enough. When he finally came down the stairs, it was almost too ordinary. He walked into the kitchen with that same calm ease, hair still tousled, like nothing about yesterday had been extraordinary. He asked about breakfast, his tone even, his expression steady. I tried to match that steadiness, but inside I was a mess of nerves. We spoke about small things, whether the gutters held through the storm, whether the roof would need another inspection before autumn, but beneath the surface of each word was something unsaid. It was there in the way I avoided his eyes for too long, in the way he hesitated before reaching for his mug. After lunch, the tension didn't ease. Instead, it hung in the air like humidity. My husband's absence, the thing I had grown so accustomed to, felt heavier now, more glaring. Before, his absence had been a quiet ache, something I managed. Now it felt like an open space filled with all the things I shouldn't have felt the night before. When he offered to drive me into town for groceries, I agreed too quickly, almost grateful for the excuse to get out of the house. The drive started simply enough, the car smelling faintly of rain-damp upholstery, the radio low, the windshield wipers squeaking every so often at the last remnants of drizzle. We didn't talk much at first. The silence wasn't awkward, exactly, but it wasn't comfortable either. It was thick, dense, like a shared secret we didn't quite know how to carry yet. At a stoplight, I caught his reflection in the window. He was looking at the road, but there was something in the angle of his jaw, the stillness of his mouth, that made my stomach clench. I turned away quickly, pretending to focus on the scenery, though I couldn't remember a single building we passed. The town was quiet, the market half empty. Inside, I moved through the aisles on autopilot, grabbing vegetables and bread and coffee, all while acutely aware of him walking just behind me. Each time he reached for something on a high shelf, his arm brushing close, I felt my breath hitch for a fraction of a second. We made the trip back in the same low silence, the car filled with the faint smell of groceries and the sound of the engine. On the way home, the road curved over an old wooden bridge, the kind that creaked under the weight of the tires. He slowed there, not much, just enough that I noticed. The rain started again, light but steady, and he pulled over for a moment, said something about checking the windshield wipers, though they were working fine. The car sat still, the sound of rain on the roof filling the space. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. Because even without looking, I could feel that the space between us wasn't really space anymore. It was an invisible thread, taut, humming. When we finally pulled back onto the road, neither of us said a word. But the silence had changed. It wasn't just quiet, it was charged. Back at the house, unloading groceries felt surreal. The bags rustled, the fridge door thumped shut, but all I could think about was the way the rain had sounded on the car roof, how close we had felt even in that silence. When he left the kitchen, I stayed behind, fingers gripping the edge of the counter, staring at the tiles. I wanted to convince myself I could draw a line, that I could pull this all back into something harmless, something forgettable. But the truth pressed in on me, undeniable. What had happened on the porch hadn't been erased by sleep, and the drive today hadn't eased it, it had deepened it. I wasn't just thinking about that kiss anymore. I was thinking about what might happen next. The morning after our trip into town felt strangely hollow, as if something essential had been pulled out of the air and left a vacuum behind. The rain had finally stopped, and the sun edged its way through a gray sky, but that light didn't seem to reach me. I moved through the house with a restlessness I couldn't shake. Every room felt the same, too familiar and too heavy all at once. I tried to ground myself in the ordinary, laundry, wiping down the counters, rearranging books that didn't need rearranging. But with each meaningless task, my mind circled back to the same place. The porch. The rain. That first kiss. The silence in the car yesterday, thick as fog. There was no undoing it now. Around noon, my phone buzzed. A message from my closest friend, *, I'm nearby, want to catch up? I'll drop by for tea. *. For a moment, I thought about saying no. The idea of having her here, of being under her gaze, made my stomach tighten. But refusing would raise questions. So I replied yes, typing out the word with hands that didn't feel steady. When she arrived, the house smelled faintly of the stew reheated from last night and lemon from the countertop cleaner. She stepped inside like she always did, without ceremony, and her eyes scanned the room the way hers always had, a quick glance at the coat rack, the neatness of the table, the position of my shoes near the door. "You look different," she said, almost casually, as she unwound her scarf. "Lighter somehow." Her words were simple, but they landed like a weight. I felt my throat tighten, and before I could find a response, she added, "Good different, I think." But different. I busied myself with the kettle, the cups, the sugar, anything to avoid the sharpness of her observation. But she kept looking at me, and I could feel it, the way her eyes were trained, not cruel, but searching. As we sat with steaming cups between us, the conversation started safe enough, the weather, the state of the roads, a story about someone she'd run into at the store. But I could feel her circling, the way she always did when she sensed something unspoken. There was a pause, and then she tilted her head slightly. "You seem brighter. Did something happen?" It was a gentle question, not an accusation. But my heart still lurched, and I heard myself laugh softly, too quickly, a sound that didn't feel real. "Maybe it's just the change in weather," I said, setting down my cup too carefully. She didn't press, not outright, but her eyes stayed on me a second too long before she smiled and changed the subject. But the seed was planted. When she finally left, the house felt heavier than before. The walls seemed closer. Her words, her look, they clung to me. Later in the afternoon, I heard him in the living room, the sound of boxes being shifted, the scrape of furniture legs across the floor. He was helping move things I'd mentioned months ago but never gotten to, the bookcases, the cabinet that had needed shifting for years. I walked in and saw him crouched by the shelves, sleeves rolled up, hair falling slightly into his eyes as he pushed an old armchair aside. "Careful," I said, though my voice came out softer than intended. He glanced up, smiling faintly, and went back to work. We moved in silence for a while, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but felt like it could tip over at any moment. Our hands met briefly when both reached for the same stack of books, and neither of us moved away quickly enough. The contact was brief, but it sparked the same awareness as before, a heat that spread out from the point of touch. I told myself it was nothing. Just hands brushing over a pile of paper and dust. But the lie didn't hold. That evening, I sat at the table long after dinner, my tea growing cold, staring at the faint smudges of fingerprints on the edge of the cabinet we'd moved. And I thought about my friend's eyes, sharp and knowing. I thought about how little it would take for someone to notice, really notice. I thought about what would happen if they did. And as the house grew dark, I realized the fear had settled in now, not sharp and sudden, but low and steady, a hum under my skin that wouldn't go away. The days after my friend's visit felt different, though I couldn't decide if it was because of what she'd said or because of the way her eyes had lingered, searching for answers I wasn't ready to give. The house felt less safe now, as if her presence had left cracks in the walls where suspicion could seep in. I kept replaying her voice in my head, that offhand comment about how I seemed brighter. It should have been a compliment, but instead, it sounded like a warning. I tried to focus on the mundane things that used to anchor me, folding laundry, watering the plants, organizing cupboards that didn't need organizing. But no matter how many chores I stacked on top of each other, I couldn't bury the thoughts that kept rising. They slipped through everything, filling the quiet with a constant hum. By the third morning, I stopped pretending. I woke up restless, a feeling I couldn't name twisting inside me. The sun was out for the first time in days, the light falling sharp across the kitchen floor. He was outside when I saw him through the window, picking up fallen branches in the garden, his shirt loose, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. Something in my chest tightened, and I hated how automatic it felt. When he came back in, carrying a basket of apples he'd collected from under the tree, the air shifted again. He set the basket down on the counter with a faint thud, and for a moment, the room felt too small for both of us. "Too many fell in the rain," he said, brushing off his hands, his voice casual, almost easy. I nodded, too aware of my own movements, the way my fingers fidgeted with the hem of my sleeve. We ended up in the garden together that afternoon, though I couldn't remember whose idea it was. The sun was warmer than it had been in weeks, the air thick with the smell of wet soil. The grass was slick under our boots as we bent to gather what the storm had shaken loose. It should have been simple, just apples, just a basket, just two people picking up what had fallen. But it wasn't. Each time our hands reached for the same apple, they brushed. Not hard, not obvious, but enough. Enough to remind me of the porch, of the rain, of the kiss that had already blurred the lines between what was safe and what wasn't. At one point, I dropped an apple and bent to grab it just as he did, our hands colliding, our faces suddenly too close. I could smell the faint scent of the soap he used, feel the warmth radiating from him. I should have stepped back. I should have said something light, something to cut the tension. But I didn't. It was different this time, not hesitant like the first, not a question, but an answer. I felt my breath catch as we broke apart, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The garden seemed unnaturally still, the only sound the distant hum of a bee, the distant drip of water from a leaf. I stepped back first, the ground soft beneath my shoes, the weight of what we'd just done pressing into my chest. We didn't speak. We didn't have to. The silence was louder than words, heavier than anything we could have said. When we carried the basket of apples back to the house, I noticed my hands shaking slightly as I rinsed them at the sink. He moved quietly behind me, his footsteps careful, deliberate. I stood at the counter after he left the room, staring at the apples spread out to dry, their skins shining in the sunlight. They looked ordinary. Perfectly ordinary. But nothing about the moment felt ordinary. Because this kiss didn't feel like a line we'd crossed by accident. It felt like we'd stepped over it on purpose. The kiss in the garden stayed with me like a mark I couldn't scrub off, even though I spent the next day trying to bury it under normalcy. I threw myself into housework, into endless little tasks that didn't really need to be done, vacuuming the same hallway twice, reorganizing the spice cabinet, washing curtains that weren't even dirty. I thought if I kept moving, I wouldn't think about it. But it didn't work. Every chore felt hollow, every movement pointless, because no matter what I did, the memory of that kiss pressed against me, unrelenting. I caught myself watching the clock, not because I had anywhere to be, but because I was waiting for the sound of his footsteps on the stairs, for his voice drifting from the other room. The awareness of him was constant now, like a low hum in the background of everything I did. When the phone rang that morning, I was almost grateful for the interruption, until I saw the name on the screen. My friend again. Her voice, when I picked up, carried that same undertone as before, the one that felt like it reached beneath my answers. "How are you?" she asked, a simple question, but it landed heavy, as if it meant more than it should. I told her I was fine. I made my voice steady, casual, but I heard myself add too much detail, how I'd been cleaning, how I was reorganizing things, how the rain had finally stopped. The words came out fast, and I hated how they sounded, like I was trying too hard to fill the silence. "I just wanted to check in," she said after a pause, and though her tone was soft, I felt something sharpen under it, as if she suspected there was something she wasn't being told. When I hung up, I stood still for a long time, the dial tone gone, the house too quiet again. By afternoon, the sky shifted. The clouds gathered again, though not heavy enough for rain, just enough to dim the light, to pull a grayness over the house. I felt that grayness inside me too. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, leaning slightly against the frame, his hair still damp from a shower, a towel slung over his shoulder. The sight of him made my chest tighten, though I tried to keep my face neutral. "Do you need anything from town later?" he asked, his voice light, almost careful. I shook my head too quickly. "No. Everything's fine." The exchange was nothing, on the surface. But it left an echo. That evening, the rain started again, soft at first, then heavier. The sound filled the house, a rhythm that felt both comforting and too intimate. I was sitting at the table when he walked in, holding his jacket in one hand. "Do you want to get some air?" he asked. "Just a short walk. The rain's not too bad." I should have said no. I should have told him I had things to do, that I was tired. But I didn't. The air outside was cool, the rain fine and misting, the kind that clung to your skin but didn't soak you. We walked along the narrow street, the sound of water dripping from the trees louder than our footsteps. At first, we spoke about nothing, the storm last week, how the gutters had held, how the air smelled fresher now. But as we walked, the words thinned. The pauses between them grew longer. By the time we reached the corner, neither of us was talking anymore. The rain tapped softly on our shoulders, on the brim of my coat, on the hood of his jacket. The street was empty, the houses dark, as if the world had pulled back and left only us standing there. I felt his hand brush against mine once, light as a thread. I didn't move away. By the time we turned back, the silence between us wasn't just silence, it was something else entirely, heavy, charged, almost fragile. When we stepped back into the house, I felt it all over again, the awareness, the pull, the feeling that we were teetering on an edge that no amount of ordinary conversation could erase. And I realized, with a sharpness that left me breathless, that this wasn't just something that had happened. This was something that was happening. The house felt smaller that night, as if the walls had pressed in closer to trap us in a space charged with all the things left unsaid. The rain pounded steadily against the windows, drowning out other sounds, making the world outside disappear into a blur of water and shadow. I sat in the living room, the soft glow of a single lamp casting long shadows, and felt the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on me. He was there too, close but not touching, and the silence between us was thick, not the comfortable quiet of familiarity, but something taut, like a thread pulled tight until it threatened to snap. We didn't talk about the kiss. We didn't talk about the garden or the walk in the rain. It was as if acknowledging it would make it real, irrevocable. But the air between us held it all, the heat, the tension, the shift that had already changed us both. At one point, he moved closer, tentatively, and I didn't pull away. The space between us closed in a way that left no room for retreat. The night stretched on, and the storm outside echoed the turmoil inside. I could feel the pulse in my veins, the quickening of my breath, the way my skin seemed alive with a tension I hadn't known I'd been carrying. When we finally crossed that line, not with words, but with presence, everything else faded into the background. The rain's steady drum, the quiet house, the world that had been until now, none of it mattered. We spent the night together. Morning came slow and hesitant, the light filtering softly through the curtains, painting the room in shades of gray and gold. We lay there in the quiet, the weight of what had happened settling around us like a fragile truce. Neither of us spoke. The silence was both a balm and a barrier. I felt an unfamiliar mix of emotions, relief, guilt, fear, and something else, a strange calm that came from crossing a point of no return. As I dressed later, the simple act of putting on my clothes felt strange, like stepping into a new skin that didn't quite fit. The house was still quiet, but now it held the echoes of what had passed, in every shadow and every corner. I saw him in the kitchen as I passed. He was washing dishes, his back to me, and for a moment I wanted to reach out, to say something, anything. But the words caught in my throat, swallowed by the uncertainty between us. The day went on, filled with the usual tasks and noises, but underneath it all was a tension that pulsed quietly, a secret that neither of us dared to speak aloud. I realized then that nothing would be the same again. The line we had crossed had changed everything, and the world I thought I knew had shifted beneath my feet. And yet, the question lingered, heavier than any certainty, what came next? The morning after felt strangely quiet, like the house itself was holding its breath. Light filtered weakly through the curtains, soft and pale, but it didn't feel like morning used to. Every sound seemed sharper, the faint clink of a spoon against a mug, the creak of the floor under my feet, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. These were normal noises, but nothing felt normal anymore. I moved through the kitchen with measured steps, as if careful movements could keep the weight of last night from crashing over me. I placed the kettle on the stove, my hands steady on the outside but trembling just enough that I noticed. When it started to whistle, the sound was almost too loud, cutting through the thick quiet like a blade. He was already awake, and I felt his presence before I saw him. It wasn't something I could explain, just the way the room seemed different when he was in it. He stood by the counter, rinsing a glass, his back to me, shoulders straight but not rigid, as if he, too, was trying to appear calm. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't just silence anymore, it was something else entirely. It was the echo of what we had done, the space between us now filled with everything we couldn't say. When he finally glanced over his shoulder, there was no accusation in his expression, no demand for explanation. But there was something there, something unreadable and heavy. I turned back to the kettle, pouring the hot water into a mug, pretending the simple act of making tea could hold me together. The tea tasted flat. Or maybe it wasn't the tea. The morning dragged. The familiar rhythm of daily life, laundry, dishes, small household tasks, should have felt grounding, but each task felt hollow. Folding towels, I saw his shirt in the basket, and my hands froze. The fabric was still faintly warm from the dryer, and holding it felt like holding a secret I couldn't put back down. When I went outside later to hang some sheets, the sun was brighter than it had been in weeks. The air smelled of wet grass, the ground still damp from the rain. For a brief moment, the sunlight on my skin felt almost normal, almost like the world hadn't shifted. But the moment didn't last. He came out too, carrying a basket of tools, saying something about needing to check the gate before the next storm. His voice was even, but the space between his words felt loaded. I answered something simple, something ordinary, and hated how rehearsed it sounded. As he walked past me toward the gate, I caught myself watching him, noticing the small things I shouldn't have, the way his hand brushed dirt off his jeans, the way the light caught his hair. These were details I should have ignored, but now they seemed amplified, unavoidable. The rest of the day was a blur of quiet movements and glances that didn't last long enough to be called stares but lingered just long enough to make my pulse quicken. When I sat at the table that evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the room, I felt the weight of it all pressing harder. I thought about my husband. About his steady voice on the phone, the messages he left, the way he always signed off with, "Take care of yourself." I thought about how easy it had been, before all this, to separate my life into neat compartments: wife, stepmother, friend. Now the lines were blurred, smudged, almost unrecognizable. I caught myself wondering how I would look in his eyes if he knew, if he could see what had already happened, what I had let happen. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet again, the kind of quiet that made your thoughts too loud. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the echo of everything that had been done and everything that still hung between us. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about what had happened last night. It was about everything that would come after. The next day brought no storm, but the stillness in the house felt more suffocating than rain ever could. The sun came through the curtains in pale, uneven slants, touching the corners of the kitchen table and the floorboards by the doorway, but the light didn't ease the weight pressing on my chest. I woke up early, earlier than I needed to, and stood at the window staring out at the yard. It should have looked peaceful, the grass wet from the night dew, the apple tree still, the air almost clear. But it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the quiet was watching me. I made coffee and sat at the table, wrapping my hands around the cup for warmth that never reached me. Every sound was sharp and intrusive, the squeak of the chair when I shifted, the faint groan of the kettle settling back on the counter, even the hum of the refrigerator in the next room. It all felt amplified, as if the house itself was holding a secret it couldn't contain much longer. It wasn't just me anymore. I felt it in him too. When he came into the kitchen that morning, there was a hesitation in his steps, a pause in the doorway like he wasn't sure if he should come in or stay away. He said good morning, his voice calm but too careful, and I answered, pretending my hands weren't shaking slightly as I set down the mug. We avoided each other's eyes. It wasn't deliberate, not exactly, it was more like instinct, like the gaze would burn if it lasted too long. The silence between us wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't empty either. It was a container, holding everything we weren't saying. By midday, I told myself I needed a distraction. Something to cut through the fog in my head. I wiped counters that were already clean, straightened picture frames that didn't need straightening. But every task felt like stalling, as if I was waiting for something I couldn't name. The phone rang just after noon. The sound jolted me more than it should have. I looked at the screen and felt my breath catch when I saw her name, my friend, again. I thought about letting it ring, but I didn't. I picked up. Her voice was warm but sharp underneath, the way it always was when she was trying to read between the lines. I was nearby yesterday, she said. I almost stopped by again. Should I have? My throat felt dry. I told her no, I'd been busy, I didn't want her to come all that way. But my words came out too fast, like I was swatting away more than just a visit. There was a pause on her end, the kind of pause that says more than words. Then she asked, "Are you sure you're all right?" That question stayed with me long after I hung up. The house felt tighter, smaller, after the call. I walked from room to room, unable to settle. I could feel her gaze in my mind, the way she'd looked at me last time, searching, suspicious even if she didn't mean to be. Later, in the evening, I saw him in the kitchen. He was standing by the sink, sleeves rolled up, rinsing a dish. It was such an ordinary sight, but my heart lurched all the same. He turned slightly, glanced at me. It wasn't a long look, but it was enough. Enough to remind me of the things we'd done, and the things we'd still left unsaid. I wanted to speak, to say something that could shift us back into safe territory, but the words wouldn't come. Every sentence I thought of felt like it would either break the fragile quiet or expose everything we were holding back. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor. I thought about my husband, his absence, his trust, the ordinariness of his last call. I thought about my friend, her voice sharper each time she called, the weight of her unspoken questions. And I thought about him, about the way he'd looked at me tonight, the way his eyes lingered a second too long. It was no longer just about what we had done. It was about how close the truth felt now, circling, pressing in, as if one more glance, one more slip, one more question from the wrong person could bring it all crashing down. The morning began with a gray sky and an odd kind of stillness, as if the world outside the windows had paused. The quiet in the house felt different today, heavier, layered with everything unsaid and everything done. I woke before the alarm, staring at the ceiling, my body still and my mind restless, tangled in thoughts I couldn't sort out. I made coffee the same way I always did, measuring the grounds, waiting for the slow drip, but the ritual no longer grounded me. The smell filled the kitchen, familiar but hollow, like a song you once loved but couldn't listen to the same way anymore. When I sat down at the table, I didn't drink the coffee right away. I wrapped my hands around the mug, feeling the heat seep into my palms, and looked out the window. The yard looked the same, the apple tree, the damp grass, the pale slant of early light, but I didn't feel the same looking at it. I heard him moving upstairs, the faint creak of floorboards, the soft thud of footsteps. That sound used to mean nothing. Now it meant everything. Every creak, every step was a reminder, not just of last night, but of every moment that had led to it. When he came into the kitchen, his face was calm, his movements easy, but I saw the same thing in him that I felt in myself, an effort to make the ordinary look natural, to move through the motions as if nothing beneath the surface had shifted. We didn't talk much. He asked if there was anything I needed from the store, and I said no. He mentioned the weather, and I nodded. Each word was carefully chosen, stripped of weight, but the silence that followed every small exchange carried all the weight we weren't letting out. The hours of the day blurred. I washed dishes that didn't need washing, folded laundry already folded. Every task was a way to keep moving, to keep from thinking too much about what was waiting in my head when I stopped. My phone buzzed in the early afternoon. The sight of my friend's name on the screen made my stomach tighten. I didn't answer. I let it ring out and left the phone on the counter, face down, as if that could keep the questions away. The house felt tighter as the day went on. The walls seemed closer. The air seemed thicker. I thought about my husband. I thought about the life we had built, the quiet routines, the years of trust. I thought about the look on his face if he knew. And then I thought about the way it felt when that trust no longer sat as cleanly as it once had, when it felt like a weight instead of a comfort. Later, I walked to the window and stood there for a long time, staring out at the rain starting to mist against the glass again. The sound was soft, almost soothing, but it didn't soothe me. I thought about the night we had crossed that last line, the way it had felt like stepping into something irreversible. I thought about the kiss in the garden, the first kiss on the porch, the countless glances, the quiet walks, the things that built up like drops of water until the flood came. I thought about the choice that wasn't really a choice anymore. When he walked into the room later, there was no conversation. Just a look that held too much and said too little. I turned back to the window, my fingers curled around the edge of the curtain. The rain streaked down the glass, blurring the shapes of the world outside. I stood there, watching, holding the weight of everything I couldn't say, everything I couldn't undo. And I knew that life would never return to what it had been before. Because some truths never leave you. And some nights you can never take